The hum of machinery never truly stopped aboard the USS Ronald Reagan, but on that particular morning, there was an uneasy rhythm in the way it droned. Salt, heavy winds battered the massive steel island, and crew members moved with the precision of muscle memory. But beneath their routine steps was a tension no one dared voice aloud. In the ready room, Lieutenant Mark Rawlins stood silently in his flight suit, staring at the mission briefing projected on the wall. His fingers tapped nervously against his kneeboard as the launch checklist repeated in his mind. At 32 years old, Rawlins had logged over 900 hours in the F-18 Super Hornet, but today's sortie was already giving him a bad feeling. The sea was rougher than expected, and weather updates hinted at shifting gusts, unfavorable for clean launches. Still, the chain of command had issued the green light. Strike training needed to continue. Carrier readiness was non-negotiable, even in dicey conditions. Around him, the other pilots joked quietly, sipped black coffee from tin mugs, or scribbled on maps with grease pencils. Rawlins remained still. The call came in over the comms. "Flight ops commence in 5 mics. Pilots to deck." Moments later, he stepped into the daylight, blinking as the blinding sky met the gray deck. Sailors darted like ants around the fighter jets, checking arrestor cables and securing gear. Rawlins spotted Petty Officer Jules, the catapult crew chief, waving him over. Her face was calm but distant. She too had heard the odd vibration earlier that morning during pre-launch diagnostics. Something in the steam catapult didn't sit right, but the technicians had brushed it off. "Transient pressure anomaly," they'd said. "Nothing worth holding up a launch for." Rawlins nodded at Jules, then climbed the ladder into the cockpit of his Super Hornet. The canopy sealed shut with a hiss. Inside the bubble of plexiglass, the world narrowed to screens, dials, and switches. He completed his startup sequence with textbook precision, but when the catapult crew signaled go for launch, his gut clenched. The deck was pitching harder now. Wind gusts clawed at the aircraft, nudging it ever so slightly off alignment. "Eagle 1 ready?" Rawlins reported. "Roger, Eagle 1, you're cleared." The launch officer crouched beside the aircraft, eyes on Rawlins, fist raised, then dropped. The shot line snapped, steam roared, and the jet was hurled forward. Instantly, Rawlins sensed something was off. The initial jolt lacked power. The aircraft surged down the catapult track, but the acceleration lagged. He pulled back on the stick, too early, but instinct screamed at him. The nose lifted sluggishly. The jet cleared the deck, but not by much. Alarms shrieked in his ears. A hydraulic warning flashed red. The Super Hornet began to bank hard left, nose falling. Rawlins fought it, hands clawing at the stick and throttle. The ocean rushed up. He had seconds. He yanked the yellow and black ejection handles. The seat exploded upward, severing the canopy. Heat punched his chest like a sledgehammer. A moment later, the jet plunged nose first into the water, vanishing beneath the surface with a sickening splash. Above, a tiny chute opened. Rawlins dangled in the sky. On the deck, chaos broke loose. Petty Officer Jules screamed into her radio, "Pilot in the water! Get SAR in the air now!" The crash alarm blared across the ship. Sailors bolted to stations. A rescue chopper already warming up on the rear platform lifted off before its blades even finished spooling. As the Seahawk circled, the flight crew watched the sea in agonized silence. They spotted him. Rawlins was alive, conscious, bobbing among the waves in his survival suit. Within minutes, he was hoisted aboard, his face pale, eyes dazed but alert. Back on deck, the F-18's wreckage left no oil slick, no wreckage visible, just an eerie silence over the water. The launch officer stood frozen. Jules stared at the catapult's steam track, lips tightening. Something had failed. The debrief later that afternoon was swift but sterile. The captain's voice was even. "Preliminary findings indicate possible underthrust from Catapult 3. An investigation is underway. All catapult operations suspended until further notice." Rawlins sat silently in the medical bay as a corpsman checked his vitals. His mind played the moment over and over, the sluggish acceleration, the nose drop, the warble in the left engine. It didn't make sense. He'd flown that plane before. He knew its quirks. This wasn't pilot error. A knock came at the door. Jules stepped in, her uniform damp from earlier spray. "Mark," she said quietly, "you weren't crazy." I flagged it. The vibration, the readings, nobody wanted to hear it. He looked at her, then out the porthole at the fading light. "Somebody's going to," he said. And somewhere deep below the surface, the Super Hornet rested silently, its secrets waiting to be retrieved. 2 days after the crash, a subdued quiet lingered aboard the USS Ronald Reagan. The flight deck, usually humming with kinetic energy, was uncharacteristically idle. Catapult 3 had been cordoned off, orange flags whipping in the wind, a symbolic reminder of how close tragedy had come. Though Lieutenant Rawlins had walked away from the incident, the crew hadn't. Whispers coursed through the passageways, questions muttered between coffee refills and maintenance checks. What exactly went wrong? Who was to blame? In the ship's war room, Commander Elisa Grant, deck boss and senior flight operations officer, paced along the tactical chart projected across the table. Her expression was unreadable, but the tightness in her jaw betrayed the weight she carried. A seasoned officer with a background in aeronautical engineering, she had risen through the ranks not by charm, but by solving problems faster than they could multiply. This one, however, was wrapped in politics. She turned to face the maintenance chief, Warrant Officer Delgado, who stood stiffly at attention. "You're telling me the logs showed nothing abnormal before the launch?" Delgado hesitated. "Ma'am, no official flags, but Petty Officer Jules submitted a manual concern. Vibration in the steam pressure chamber. Engineering signed it off as non-critical." Grant's stare sharpened. "Who in engineering?" "Lieutenant Myers. Said it fell within tolerance." "Then why did we nearly lose a pilot?" Silence answered her. Grant slammed her pen down. "Tell Myers to meet me in the incident review room. Now!" Elsewhere, Rawlins sat hunched at a workstation in the intelligence bay. His left shoulder was bandaged, stiff from the ejection impact, but he had refused rest. He watched grainy footage on loop, his own launch from the flight deck's camera. Every frame was burned into his memory, the moment of misfire, the tilt, the sky snapping into sea. Behind him, Jules entered quietly, carrying a sealed evidence pouch. "Recovered your helmet cam footage," she said. "It confirms what you felt. Undercut steam thrust. You were 10 knots under launch target speed." Rawlins exhaled sharply. "That shouldn't happen. Not with a clean launch order." "It shouldn't," she echoed. "Unless someone fudged the diagnostics." He looked at her. "You're saying it was covered up?" "I'm saying someone decided hitting schedule was more important than heeding a warning." Rawlins clenched his jaw. This wasn't a fluke. It was a failure, and it could have killed me. Back in the incident review room, Commander Grant stared down Lieutenant Myers across the table. The young engineer fidgeted under her gaze, fingers clasped tight. "You disregarded the anomaly Jules flagged," Grant said coldly. "It registered as transient noise," he said, voice brittle. "The system had passed full diagnostics just the night before. If we halted for every spike—" "You don't decide when to halt, Lieutenant. The data does." Grant leaned in. "You signed off on a launch system that hadn't been physically inspected after a flagged concern. You gambled with a pilot's life." Myers flushed but said nothing. Grant's voice dropped, deadly calm. "If the Navy finds this negligence, you won't be serving aboard another ship." As Myers left, visibly shaken, Grant turned to the silent observer in the room, Captain Hendricks, the ship's commanding officer. He hadn't spoken during the interrogation, but his presence had been impossible to ignore. "She's right," Hendricks finally said. "We've been pushing operations too hard. They're cutting corners because we've trained them to prioritize tempo over safety." Someone has to answer for this, Grant replied. Pilots won't fly if they can't trust the system. That evening, word spread that Naval Command was dispatching an investigative unit to board the carrier within 48 hours. Until then, no jets would take off, and Catapult 3 would be dismantled piece by piece for a full inspection. Rawlins stood again at the edge of the flight deck, staring out into the wind. He knew now it wasn't just about him or a malfunctioning piece of machinery. It was about a culture, one that demanded perfection at high speed no matter the cost. Behind him, Jules joined him silently. "They're going to try to pin it on a single person," she said quietly. "Make it neat." "But it wasn't one person," he replied. "It was a system built to ignore hesitation." The ocean below surged dark and restless. Somewhere beneath those waves, the broken body of his fighter jet rested, silent testimony to the day the system blinked. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The fight for answers had just begun. The arrival of the investigative unit was met with silent tension across the USS Ronald Reagan. The sharp white uniforms of the NavInspect team stood in stark contrast to the grease-smeared coveralls of the ship's sailors. Clipboard in hand, Commander Lena Moreau, a forensic systems analyst known across the Pacific Fleet for her unflinching audits, led the inspection with clinical precision. Her eyes missed nothing, from hairline fractures in launch catapult valves to inconsistencies in maintenance logs. Within hours, the scale of procedural shortcuts became undeniable. Inside the ready room, Lieutenant Rawlins sat before a tribunal of officers and investigators, recounting the seconds leading up to the crash. His voice was steady, but every word carried the weight of a man who had glimpsed the edge. He spoke of the underthrust, the delayed disengagement of the launch bar, the unnatural vibration before takeoff. But when Moreau questioned him, her tone shifted from analytical to oddly personal. "Lieutenant, did you trust the catapult system before this launch?" Rawlins met her gaze. "I did." "And now?" "I don't know. I trust the crew who operate it. I don't trust the decisions made above them." That distinction hung in the air like a thundercloud. In the ship's maintenance bay, Petty Officer Jules stood with Warrant Officer Delgado beside the open catapult machinery. The exposed piping glinted under floodlights. Delgado held a thermal imaging scanner over the intake valve, eyes narrowing as the heat signature displayed a ghost of what had gone wrong, a micro-fracture in the primary steam line, barely visible but fatal under high pressure. Jules said nothing. She didn't have to. They both knew that even a perfect inspection wouldn't have caught it unless someone had physically unbolted the panel. The system had passed because it hadn't truly been checked. In a nearby compartment, Commander Elisa Grant reviewed the final audit report from Moreau's team. The words on the page were clinical, phrases like procedural lapse, failure to verify, systemic underreporting. But to her, it translated to one thing: the truth they'd all suspected but hadn't spoken aloud. The culture of speed had overtaken the doctrine of safety. Grant set the tablet down and folded her hands. Captain Hendricks entered without knocking. "They're recommending grounding all steam catapult launches until retrofits are done across the fleet," he said, sounding almost relieved. Grant nodded. "It's the right call. The brass won't be happy. Delays, missed schedules. But no more funerals," she said, looking him in the eye. That night on the lower deck, Rawlins found himself alone in the hangar bay. His helmet, cracked from the ejection, sat on a bench like a war trophy. He ran his hand over it, thumb tracing the edge of the fracture. It had saved his life, but it was more than a piece of gear now. It was a symbol, a reminder that no system is perfect, that the machine isn't the only thing that needs fixing. Jules joined him again, hands in her pockets, eyes distant. "They're grounding the catapults. Word just came down." He looked at her, searching for something in her face. "Will it change anything?" It has to, she replied, but culture doesn't shift overnight. Then we keep pushing it, he said. One check, one report, one refusal to look the other way. Jules smiled faintly. You make a terrible optimist. Just a pissed-off realist. She laughed, and the tension between them softened for the first time since the crash. In that moment, neither of them were just parts of a machine. They were people, bearing the weight of mistakes, but refusing to be buried by them. Far above, the stars stretched over the endless black ocean, indifferent to the lives moving beneath them. The Ronald Reagan would sail on, jets would fly again. But something had shifted, quietly, irreversibly. Not because of commands or policies, but because a handful of people had refused to let silence win. And as the night deepened around the steel giant, there was one truth that burned brighter than the flight deck lights. In the space between danger and duty, it's not machines that make the difference. It's those who choose to stand, question, and fix what others ignore.